Welcome to the Psychology Undergrad.
This is a massive one. So grab your highlighters, maybe put your notes away for a bit, because this is our ultimate wall-to-wall exam prep deep dive.
Yep. We are covering the entire course material on adolescence.
We're talking approximately 160 key terms, concepts, and theories.
Exactly. And our mission today isn't just to, list off definitions. It's to give you the mechanisms, the connections.
Yeah.
The stuff you absolutely need to not only pass, but to actually get this material.
We've sort of structured this whole thing around the three critical tectonic shifts that really define this period.
The biological, the cognitive, and the social role changes.
Right. And these forces don't happen in a vacuum, they collide. And that collision is what prompts these huge fluctuations in self-esteem and self-conceptions.
So the young person is questioning who they are on the inside, while their entire external reality is shifting. It must feel like their personality is just fundamentally changing.
It's a lot. So let's stop wasting time and just jump straight in.
Let's do it. Starting with the foundational concepts, how we even define and study this incredibly complex period.
Okay, kicking off with the big picture. To really understand adolescence, you have to pull from 9 core disciplines. These aren't just labels, they're different ways of seeing the same thing.
Totally. You can kind of group them. 5 are focused on the individual's internal world. So you start with the biological perspective.
The onset of puberty, the hardware changes.
Then the emotional perspective, which is all about that necessary psychological detachment from parents.
Then you've got the cognitive lens, looking at that explosion of new reasoning abilities.
And the interpersonal, which shifts focus to peer relations, to friendships. And then finally, the social discipline, which looks at how society handles role training and, preparation for being an adult.
And then you layer on top of that the 4 contextual fields, which really determine how all that other stuff plays out.
The educational, legal, chronological, and cultural contexts.
Exactly. And it takes all 9 of those lenses interacting, from microhormonal changes to macrocultural expectations, to really get the complexity of the teenage years.
So let's organize this whole transition chronologically. We basically break adolescence down into 3 phases, plus this really crucial transitional period that's kind of new.
Right. We start with early adolescence. Think 10 to 13 years old. This is where all the intense physiological changes are happening.
Then you move into middle adolescence, from 14 to 17. This is where the cognitive and social issues really take center stage, especially identity.
And then late adolescence, from 18 to 21, where the focus shifts heavily toward achievement, autonomy, and getting ready for adult roles.
And then there's this new essential term, emerging adulthood. This is roughly 18 to 25.
It's not really adolescence anymore, but it's definitely not full adulthood either. It's this prolonged in-between period defined by 5 key features we'll hit later. But it's a direct result of modern society delaying everything.
And all these stages are driven by 3 huge, overarching fundamental changes.
First, the biological one, puberty. It completely alters your physical appearance and how your body works.
Second, the cognitive transitions, marked by this new ability for advanced abstract thinking.
And finally, the social transitions. This is where you move into new roles, get new rights, new responsibilities, and crucially, a new social status.
To understand how all these systems interact, we absolutely have to master Bronfenbrenner's ecological perspective.
Right. The theory basically says that as a child develops, the quality and context of their environment get more and more complex.
But the real insight is why it gets more complex. It's because their brain and body are maturing, which lets them participate in and be affected by more layers of that environment.
So you have the microsystem, that's your immediate environment, family, school, friends.
The mesosystem is the interplay between those things, like how a fight with your parents affects how you do in school.
Then the exosystem is the stuff that indirectly affects you, like your parents' stressful job. And the macrosystem is the big picture cultural beliefs and norms.
And here's the link. An adolescent who can think abstractly, a formal operational thinker, can now grasp and get stressed out by macro-level issues like climate change or politics, which they couldn't really process before. That's the interaction.
Okay, now let's frame the core developmental work. We need to internalize the 5 main psychosocial issues that are critical throughout adolescence. These are like the core developmental jobs.
And almost every challenge we're going to talk about links back to one of these 5.
Number 1, identity, the process of figuring out who you are.
2, autonomy, establishing independence emotionally, behaviorally, and cognitively.
3, intimacy, building close non-family relationships based on trust.
4, sexuality, understanding and expressing sexual feelings.
Mhm.
And 5, achievement, being successful and competent in the world.
We also have to review the different theoretical lenses we use to explain all this, starting with the one that kind of kicked off the whole field.
The biosocial theories, like G. Stanley Hall's stuff, these theories focus almost purely on genetics and biology, and they really downplay the role of experience.
But most modern theories move away from that. The organismic theories, like Erikson's or Piaget's, they still acknowledge biology as foundational, but they stress that context and experience modify those biological forces. It's a blend.
Then you have the learning theory perspective, like social learning theory, which basically flips the script and focuses entirely on the context, how behaviors are modeled, learned, and reinforced.
The last three are less about the individual and more about the culture. Sociological theories look at adolescence as a group. Historical theories emphasize how different it was to be a teen in, say, 1900 versus today.
And anthropological theories highlight how wildly different societies construct the whole idea of adolescence, so it's profoundly culturally defined.
Okay, before we move on, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. The stereotypes.
The idea that all adolescents are troublemakers.
Right, which leads to that infamous storm and stress viewpoint, and the idea that turmoil is just an inevitable biological part of puberty.
And this is so crucial to challenge right now. The source material is very clear. The majority of teens do not go through intense turmoil.
The myth sticks around because of what we call the adolescent bias. We focus on the outliers, the troubled kids, the risk takers, which is why this idea that they're all inherently passionate and troubled just won't die.
Knowing these stereotypes helps us approach the rest of this material critically, always looking for the context, not just the biology.
Absolutely. All right, so let's dig into that biology. Puberty.
The biological foundation, we have to nail the mechanics. So the physical changes happen in 3 distinct ways that make the transition so visible.
First, the most obvious one, the rapid acceleration in growth. That's the classic growth spurt in height and weight.
Second is the development of primary sex characteristics. These are the changes directly related to reproduction, the growth of gonads, internal hormonal shifts.
And third, the development of secondary sex characteristics, all the external physical changes, body hair, breast development, genital growth, that signal to the world that you're maturing.
Now let's get technical with the engine driving all of this, the HPG axis.
The hypothalamus pituitary gonad axis.
Yeah. Think of it like a hormonal feedback loop, a really finely tuned thermostat that's actually been active for years, but it gets set to a new higher temperature around age 8.
So the process starts when the hypothalamus monitors the levels of sex hormones in your body.
Androgens and estrogens.
Right. If the levels drop below that set point, the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to get to work. The pituitary then signals the gonads, the testes or ovaries, to release more sex hormones.
And if the levels get too high, the hypothalamus just inhibits the pituitary. It's this constant, tightly regulated loop.
To categorize all this maturation, we use Tanner's stages. It's a 5-stage scale.
Stage 1 is just the pre-puberty child. Stage 2 is when you see the first visible changes as the HPG axis kicks in.
Stage 3, things become obvious. The growth spurt speeds up. Stage 4, puberty's in full swing. And stage 5 is when physical maturation is pretty much complete.
The timing and the order of these changes are so important for the psychological stuff that comes later, and we have distinct sex-specific puberty experiences.
For males, the sequence is usually growth of tests and scrotum, pubic hair, then a height spurt about a year later, then penis growth, voice change, and finally, first ejaculation.
For females, it's typically breast budding, then pubic and underarm hair, overall body growth, and then menarche, the first menstruation.
And here's a high-impact finding for the exam, the link to body image dissatisfaction for girls. Puberty for them often means an increase in body fat and wider hips, which can clash really hard with societal beauty standards.
And the timing of puberty is influenced by both nature and nurture. Genetics sets the window, but the environment really matters.
Overall physical well-being, health, and nutrition is critical. That's why we see the secular trend. Kids are reaching puberty earlier all over the world because of better health.
Family influences also play a role. Puberty can happen a bit earlier in father-absent homes. The stress from family conflict might also speed it up. And there's even a theory that the presence of a stepfather might accelerate it because of unfamiliar male pheromones.
Another big functional change we have to cover is sleep, the delayed phase preference.
Right. As teens mature, the time at night when melatonin, the sleep hormone, rises, starts to shift later and later.
So it's not that they're being defiant. Their bodies are biologically programmed to stay up later, even though the total amount of sleep they need stays the same, around 9 hours.
Okay, let's talk psychological impacts of puberty. Yes, there's a direct effect. A big one is an increase in sex drive.
It also completely changes their appearance, which messes with their self-image and changes how other people react to them.
But we have to go back and rebut that storm and stress idea directly. When you look at adolescence and moodiness, the research shows mood swings are not just from raging hormones.
No, they correlate much more strongly with the context, the activities they're doing, the rapid social changes. The moodiness is highly reactive to daily life, not just a chemical thing.
And the timing of maturation has huge social consequences, and they're very gendered. For early maturation in boys, the effects are generally positive at first.
They're seen as more mature, they often have higher self-esteem, they feel better about themselves.
However,
Yeah.
and this is the key part, the research shows a darker side. These boys also have higher rates of depression and anxiety, they lose their temper more, and they're more likely to get into deviant activities.
Why? Because they look older, so they get put in social situations they aren't emotionally ready for, and adults supervise them less because they assume they're more mature than they are.
And for early maturation in girls, the outcomes are often the reverse, more negative.
They tend to have more emotional difficulty, a poor self-image, higher rates of depression and anxiety. A lot of that is tied to that increased body fat and the unwanted attention that comes with looking older earlier.
And they're also more likely to get into problem behaviors.
Okay, finally, let's link physical development to psychopathology by looking at eating disorders. This ties directly to what we call internalized distress.
There are three main diagnoses we need to know: anorexia nervosa, self-induced weight loss, bulimia. Binge eating followed by some kind of compensatory behavior, like purging.
And binge eating disorder, which is a pattern of binging without those compensatory behaviors.
All of them are characterized by an extremely disturbed body image. And importantly, the source material notes that depression can actually come before the disorder.
Right, which suggests the eating disorder might be a maladaptive way of coping with that pain. It's all linked to this underlying problem called internalized distress, turning emotional pain inward instead of expressing it.
Okay, so as the body is transforming, the mind is making its biggest leap since they were like toddlers. These cognitive shifts change everything.
We can start with the two hallmarks of advanced reasoning that they develop. First, deductive reasoning.
That's the ability to draw logical conclusions from a general set of rules.
And second, hypothetical thinking, basically if-then thinking. This lets them consider possibilities that don't exist yet, which is vital for planning and for figuring out who you are.
This new sophistication leads to abstract thought and metacognition.
Thinking about thinking.
Yeah, it's the ability to monitor your own thought processes. This lets them start thinking in multiple dimensions, seeing shades of gray instead of just black and white.
And this new flexibility leads to adolescent relativism, the tendency to question everything and understand that a lot of truths are actually subjective.
But these new powers come with some cognitive flaws. We can group them under adolescent egocentrism. There are two key problems we have to define for the exam.
First, the imaginary audience. This is a direct result of that new metacognition. It's a heightened self-consciousness where they mistakenly believe their behavior is the focus of everyone else's attention.
You know that feeling when you have a tiny pimple and you're absolutely sure every single person is staring at it? That's the imaginary audience.
Exactly. And second is the personal fable. This is the belief that you're unique and therefore you're immune to the risks that govern everyone else.
The classic "it won't happen to me" mindset.
Yeah.
Which is, directly linked to a lot of risky behaviors.
For sure. Okay, let's review the foundational theory here. Piaget's cognitive development view. His whole thing was development happens in a fixed sequence of qualitatively distinct stages.
And for adolescents, the key stage is formal operations. It's the final stage, and it allows for that advanced, systematic, abstract thinking.
Complementing Piaget is the information processing perspective. This view explains development not by big, chunky stages, but by improvements in specific components of thinking.
Right, so it's about improvements in attention, both selective, which is focusing on one thing, and divided, which is multitasking.
Also, improvements in memory, a bigger working memory, better long-term retrieval, increased processing speed, and crucially, improved organization. They become more planful, more strategic.
And we can actually map these improvements to real structural changes in the brain, the so-called teen brain.
Yeah, we see massive synaptic pruning. That's where the brain eliminates unused connections, especially in the prefrontal cortex, or PFC.
The brain CEO, responsible for planning, complex decision-making.
Right. Pruning makes it more efficient. At the same time, you have myelination growth, where a fatty tissue wraps around nerve fibers, which dramatically speeds up communication.
And this period also sees heightened brain plasticity, meaning the brain is just super adaptable to the environment.
A key change involves the limbic system. That's the part of the brain involved in emotions, social info, reward, punishment. It develops faster than the PFC.
And these structural changes lead directly to brain function changes. You get greater efficiency and increased functional connectivity, the ability to use multiple parts of the brain at once to solve a problem.
And changes in dopamine and serotonin levels mean adolescents are often more emotional, more sensitive to stress, and engage in a lot more sensation seeking.
That's the drive for new and intense experiences, often because that reward center of the brain is just highly reactive.
Right. So when we're assessing intelligence, we use IQ tests. They're useful, but we have to understand their cultural limitations. They don't always account for context or everyday intelligence or Vygotsky's concept of
The zone of proximal development, the ZPD.
exactly, which is the difference between what you can do alone and what you can do with help. It shows that intelligence isn't just a static score, it's potential.
Which brings us to the alternative theories. Gardner's multiple intelligences says there are, like, 8 distinct types of intelligence: linguistic, musical, etc.
In contrast, Sternberg's triarchic theory argues intelligence is one capacity, but it's made of 3 parts: practical, creative, and analytical.
We have to link all this back to their social life through social cognition. That's just thinking about people and social relationships.
And a core part of that is theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have beliefs, intentions, and knowledge different from your own. This is absolutely essential for empathy and intimacy.
The changes in the social brain support this. They get more sensitive to social cues, to facial expressions, and this increased social intelligence means they start to question parental authority based on subjective reality, not just blind rules.
Our last cognitive point, risk-taking. The question isn't whether teens know about risks, it's about how they weigh them.
And the research is clear. Adolescents are way more attuned to the potential rewards than adults are.
So if the reward is social status or excitement or pure approval, that reward often outweighs the long-term abstract risks. Plus, they're susceptible to peer pressure, they're impulsive, and they're really focused on the present.
Okay, let's pivot from the internal shifts to the external structure.
Yeah.
How does society respond to this new, capable individual?
Generally, society views adolescence as this lengthy period of preparation for adulthood, which means young people are seen as needing constant guidance and supervision.
And that leads to this crucial economic dependence on parents.
And this delay just ripples across all 5 of those psychosocial tasks. For identity, they might feel immature because they lack real adult roles.
For autonomy, they have very little real independence because they're still dependent. For intimacy, it's harder because marriage and living on your own are deferred.
For sexuality, they face new adult laws. And for achievement, they have to go through years of education before they can really enter the workforce. The conflict is clear. Society tells them to prepare for autonomy, but holds back the actual tools to practice it.
We can trace the roots of this back to the Industrial Revolution. That's what encouraged kids to stay in school instead of work.
And you had the child protectionists who moved the focus to preparation rather than participation, keeping kids out of dangerous factories, and in the process creating this prolonged period of adolescence we have today.
This shift is what we call social redefinition. It's the process of society granting new rights and roles. It's not one single event, it's a series of things that happen over time, often moving kids through transitions in groups called cohorts.
Across cultures, you see 3 common practices marking this transition. Some kind of symbolic separation from parents, an emphasis on sex differences, and the passing on of information from the older generation.
Now compare the 2 critical passage types. The continuous passage is where you get guided training over a long time. You're gradually brought into adult roles through, like, an apprenticeship.
But the discontinuous passage is what most of us experience today. There's a clear cutoff like graduation, where you're suddenly thrown into independence without enough training. Modern society is highly discontinuous.
And this discontinuous structure is what defines emerging adulthood, from roughly 18 to 25. The source defines this period by 5 main features.
1. Exploration of possible identities. 2. Instability in work, relationships, living arrangements.
3. A profound focus on oneself. 4. The feeling of being between, not an adolescent, not yet an adult.
And 5. The sense that life holds many possibilities, a real optimism about the future.
Finally, let's look at the immediate environment. Neighborhood effects. These contexts affect teens in three key ways. First is collective efficacy.
That's the extent to which neighbors trust each other and are willing to monitor the youth.
And when collective efficacy is low, often because of poverty and isolation, it's devastating. Parents can't rely on neighbors for support, so deviant groups can form, and social problems basically become contagious.
Second is the powerful impact of stress. Poverty-related stress undermines relationships and leads to harsher, more inconsistent parenting.
And third is just limited access to resources. Lower quality schools, worse healthcare, poor transportation. It just systematically reduces the chances for positive development.
Okay, so the family unit. This is where those cognitive and biological changes first really collide with the social structure. Let's start with parent-adolescent conflict.
It's a common finding that the conflict is usually over small things. Curfews, clothing, chores, a messy room.
So if it's about small things, why does it feel so intense? The insight here is that the intensity comes from a clash of domains.
Parents tend to see these small things as matters of right and wrong, moral issues, or safety concerns.
But teens, using their new cognitive skills, see these exact same issues as personal choices, a domain where independence and self-expression are the most important thing.
So the fight isn't about the laundry on the floor, it's about who gets to make the decision.
Exactly. And this family shift often coincides with an overlap of crisis for the parents. The teen's maturation might hit just as the parents are facing their own challenges, a career plateau, aging, menopause, while the adolescent is just full of optimism.
And research shows that puberty itself can be a trigger, naturally intensifying conflict and creating some emotional distance.
This brings us to the 4 fundamental parenting styles. You define them by looking at responsiveness. So, warmth and acceptance, and demandingness, which is control and expectations.
And we have to get these definitions and their outcomes straight.
First up, the gold standard, authoritative parents. They're high in both responsiveness and demandingness. They're warm, they communicate, but they're also firm.
And the outcome is self-reliant adolescents with a strong sense of initiative. It works because they teach self-regulation.
Second, authoritarian parents. They're high in demandingness, but low in responsiveness. It's all about obedience and conformity. The outcome is often anxious kids who struggle with making their own decisions.
Third, indulgent parents. Highly responsive, but low in demandingness. They're super accepting and passive, focused on raising a happy child. But the outcome is often a lack of self-control.
And fourth, with the worst outcomes, you have indifferent parents. They're neither demanding nor responsive. They're basically neglectful because the family is structured around their own needs.
Fostering autonomy is so central to positive development. When you let a teen assert their opinion in a secure, loving context, it leads to higher self-esteem and better coping skills.
And a lack of autonomy can lead to depression. But a lack of emotional connectedness, that warmth and acceptance, that's what often results in externalizing or acting out problem behavior.
Okay, turning to sibling relationships. Adolescents usually see this relationship as more of a friendship than their relationship with their parents.
It involves conflict and rivalry, for sure, but also critical support. They tend to become a little more distant over time as they get independent. Same-sex siblings are often closer, but that tends to even out in late adolescence.
Now let's talk about the big findings from genetic versus environmental influences using twin studies. We have to differentiate between shared environmental influences.
Those are the non-genetic things that make siblings similar, like the neighborhood you grew up in or family income.
And non-shared environment influences, which are the unique experiences each sibling has, different friends, being treated differently by parents.
But here's the high-impact finding for the exam. For things like complex reasoning, aggression, and intelligence, the source notes that the variability is largely genetic.
That's a huge insight. It means parenting style or neighborhood, the shared environment, might have less influence on those specific traits than your genetic predisposition.
We also have to recognize the changing family life due to big demographic shifts. 4 major trends.
First, divorce. It happens earlier in marriage now, so more teens have grown up in divorced families.
Second, the rise of single parents. Third, remarriage, which is common, but these families are often unstable. They have a higher divorce rate.
And fourth, poverty. The gap between rich and poor is high, leading to a lot of economic strain.
Regarding the divorce impact, the key finding is that the quality of the relationship with the parents matters more than just living with 2 of them.
The toughest time is right around the divorce itself. And that genetic finding comes back here. Adolescents from divorced homes might have problems partly because they inherit traits, like high conflict, that might have contributed to the divorce in the first place.
The effect of economic strain on mental health is pretty clear. It worsens marriage quality and causes conflict. Persistent poverty makes parents harsher.
So to synthesize this whole section, the single biggest factor influencing adolescent adjustment is the quality of relationships at home.
Structure is less important than function. That's the takeaway.
Okay, leaving the family, we enter the world of peers and institutions. The rise of peer groups and age segregation is mostly a structural result of how schools are set up.
And this created a cultural shift from post-figurative cultures, where adults were the main socializers, to co-figurative cultures, where socialization is done mostly by other young people.
This was driven by the need to prepare huge groups of kids for modern life, which led to universalistic norms, requiring age grouping and making peer guidance necessary.
And in these groups, we have to distinguish very sharply between crowds versus cliques.
Cliques are the small, intimate groups, 2 to 12 people. They're defined by common activities. This is who you eat lunch with.
Right. But crowds are large, loosely organized groups made up of several cliques, and their membership is based entirely on reputation and stereotype.
The jocks, the nerds, the preps.
Exactly. They are not interaction groups. They serve three profound functions. They locate adolescents socially in the school hierarchy, they channel them towards certain peers, and they provide a context that rewards certain lifestyles.
They serve as a crucial reference group, a standard for social comparison. It's vital for identity formation.
We also need to distinguish between two types of popularity. Sociometric popularity is how genuinely well-liked someone is. It's based on positive things like social skills and friendliness.
But perceived popularity is about status or prestige. And the insight here is that perceived popularity often relies on aggression or antisocial behavior, being feared or envied, not on being nice.
Unpopular adolescents fall into three categories. Neglected kids are just ignored. They're shy, but usually okay.
Aggressive rejected teens have trouble controlling their aggression and are actively disliked. And withdrawn rejected adolescents are shy and anxious, and they're actively rejected because of their social awkwardness.
The outcomes for those who are rejected are significant: depression, academic problems, conduct problems, and being easy targets for bullying.
We can define victimization broadly: either direct or indirect bullying with a power imbalance, or cyberbullying, which has very similar emotional effects. It consistently undermines school performance.
Okay, a quick look at the history of formal education. Compulsory education was driven by massive social forces: industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, using schools as a means of social control and assimilation.
Schooling models today vary. Rigorous systems like standard-based reform hold everyone to the same standards, but they risk holding back too many kids.
The school transitions and mismatch is a key concept. Moving to middle or high school temporarily messes with performance and self-image.
And the mismatch happens because secondary schools are often impersonal and rigid. This clashes with the adolescent's new cognitive need for autonomy and abstract discussion. Teachers might also hold negative views of teens, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Interestingly, Catholic schools often show academic advantages. They encourage advanced courses, share similar family values, and have strong social capital, those interpersonal resources and trust networks among families.
Effective teachers are the key to engagement. They operate in an authoritative environment, just like the best parenting style, with high expectations and support.
Parental involvement directly influences student achievement, and high student engagement enhances mental health and protects against stress. But right now, engagement is generally low.
In higher education, that mismatch continues, leading to high dropout rates. The solution is better knowledge about college and better matching of students to the right school environment.
The final tension point is this. The school's focus on obedience and conformity often conflicts directly with the adolescent's intellectual development, their natural tendency to question authority.
And at the end of the day, research shows their happiness in this environment is most influenced by their peer relationships, not necessarily their grades.
Okay, identity. The most famous psychosocial task, thanks to Erikson. There are three key cognitive changes that really drive this development.
First, the formation of an image of possible selves' alternative identities they might adopt. Second, a strong future orientation thinking about long-term consequences.
And finally, facing a whole new array of choices and decisions that they have to actively make.
And compared to children, Adolescent self-conceptions are way different. They become complex, abstract, and psychological. They develop the differentiation of the self-concept.
Meaning they can link specific traits to specific situations, like I'm competitive in sports, but I'm really supportive with my friends.
This allows for organization and integration. They can distinguish between their actual self, their ideal self, and their feared self.
The downside to this is false self-behavior acting in a way you know is inauthentic, usually to impress other people. It's a common part of identity exploration.
To structure our understanding of personality, we use the Big Five personality dimensions, or OCEAN.
Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. These are pretty stable from adolescence into adulthood.
Self-esteem is also complex. It's multidimensional. You have to specify the domain. Physical, academic, athletic. And it fluctuates a ton between 12 and 14.
The big influences are the approval of others, especially parents, and succeeding in school. There's also an ethnicity influence. Black adolescents often have higher self-esteem, benefiting from strong ethnic identity and community support.
Which brings us to Erikson's identity crisis. The core struggle is identity versus identity diffusion.
And the recommended healthy resolution is a psychosocial moratorium, a socially sanctioned timeout to experiment with the different roles and personalities before you commit.
If that crisis isn't resolved well, three common problems can pop up. Identity diffusion, an incoherent, disjointed sense of self.
Identity foreclosure, a premature establishment of identity, often one set by your parents, without any real exploration. And negative identity, choosing an identity that's undesirable to others, often as a form of rebellion.
For minority youth, ethnic identity development is key. It often involves dealing with prejudice, but exploring it increases self-esteem. This is helped by racial socialization, where parents teach their kids about their cultural background.
We also define identity through gender role development. And importantly, gender stereotypes intensify in adolescence. They become more rigid in adopting these roles, probably as a way to stabilize their identity during a time of so much change.
Finally, achievement motivation. We distinguish between two goal orientations.
Mastery motivation, or intrinsic, is based on the pleasure of mastering a task. This leads to better performance. Performance motivation, or extrinsic, is based on external rewards like grades.
A maladaptive strategy we see here is self-handicapping, deliberately behaving in ways that interfere with doing well, like partying before a test, to give failure a reason other than I'm not smart.
And achievement is also influenced by beliefs like self-efficacy and the big one, stereotype threat, the belief that your social group does poorly on a task, which then causes you to perform poorly.
The social context in achievement is maybe the most critical predictor. Authoritative home environment, supportive schools.
Yeah.
But socioeconomic status, SES, is one of the most powerful influences. It's linked to higher IQ and higher academic success.
Finally, career choices are influenced by access to higher education and by your work values. Things like wanting high income, security, creativity, or helping others. It's an interaction of a lot of factors, not just individual preference.
Intimacy, the capacity for mutual trust and self-disclosure, is built on those three foundations: biology, cognition, and social roles.
Cognitive changes are crucial here. Advances in social cognition allow for greater empathy and sensitivity. The development of theory of mind, or mentalizing, being able to infer someone else's perspective, is essential for this new level of emotional closeness.
According to Sullivan's challenge, the main job of late adolescence is to integrate the need for intimacy, that deep emotional connection, with the emerging need for sexual contact, without it causing a lot of anxiety.
And attachment theory explains how our early experiences shape our later expectations. The internal working model is like a mental blueprint, a script from our early relationships that tells us what to expect from closeness.
Secure attachment leads to a positive model. Insecure attachment makes you really sensitive to rejection. The adult attachment interview is a tool that looks at recollections of those early experiences to figure out your current model.
Friendship dynamics shift dramatically. Conflict involves more hurt feelings, and resolution is more about negotiation.
Yep.
Friends share more intimate details.
And you see big gender differences. Females are generally more intimate and self-disclosing. Boys' conflicts are more about power and are usually short-lived.
Other sex friendships are significant because they're like a practice ground for later romantic relationships. Those with more opposite-sex friends tend to date earlier.
Dating shifts happen across three phases. Phase 1, 11-13, is about socializing and status. The relationships are short, based on infatuation.
Phase 2, 14-18, moves toward a more meaningful dyadic relationship, often in a group context. They last about 6 months.
And phase 3, 17-18, is where commitment concerns come in. These relationships focus on long-term survival and growth and typically last more than a year.
Okay, let's talk sexuality and socialization. The context of sexual socialization varies a lot by culture.
You have restrictive cultures where it's prohibited, semi-restrictive cultures where it's formally prohibited but not really enforced, and permissive cultures where it's more open.
Prevalence numbers depend on how you measure it, but about 65% of people report having had heterosexual sex by 18.
And crucially, sexual activity is generally not associated with psychological disturbance unless it's risky sex. That's what correlates with other problem behaviors and low religious involvement.
We have to know the reasons for inconsistent contraceptive use. It's unplanned, they can't afford it, or they have insufficient sex ed.
And when comparing education models, abstinence-only education is demonstrably not helpful. Comprehensive sex ed that focuses on reducing risky behavior is way more effective.
Let's return to the concept of autonomy. We contrast 3 types: emotional, cognitive, and behavioral.
And we contrast individuation, which is the healthy, gradual sharpening of your sense of self, with the older concept of detachment, which assumed you had to have this stressful break from your parents.
But even as they're striving for autonomy, peer pressure is incredibly strong. It shapes all the day-to-day stuff, clothes, music, substance use, all based on that fundamental need to belong.
We have to discuss Kohlberg's moral reasoning. He defined 3 levels. Pre-conventional is based on rewards and punishments.
Conventional is based on society's rules and what others will think. Most teens are here. And post-conventional is where you see rules as subjective, and you can weigh them against broader ethical principles.
But the critical nuance is the mismatch between reasoning and behavior. The reasoning breaks down when they define issues as personal choices instead of ethical dilemmas.
Right. And as part of their cognitive autonomy, their political and religious thinking also becomes more abstract and less rigid, and things like volunteerism are linked to higher moral reasoning and empathy.
Our final section, psychosocial problems. It is so important to remember that the majority of adolescents experiment with minor deviance. Problems are rarely a direct result of normal changes, and most of them are resolved by adulthood.
We categorize problems into 3 areas: substance abuse, externalizing disorders turned outward, like aggression and delinquency, and internalizing disorders, which are turned inward, like depression and anxiety.
The concept of the problem behavior syndrome links these together. It argues that the underlying trait is unconventionality, a tolerance of deviance and hostility toward authority.
And this trait leads to problem clusters. Involvement in one problem behavior tends to lead to others. Social control theory says that without strong bonds to conventional institutions, you're more likely to behave unconventionally.
For substance use, we have to know the 6 substance use trajectory groups. They're based on timing and escalation. Non-users, alcohol experimenters, low escalators, early starters, late starters, and high escalators.
The 4 sets of risk factors are psychological, familial, social, and contextual.
The consequences of early use before age 14 or 15 are really severe. It can permanently affect brain function and massively increase the risk for addiction.
Now, a crucial differentiation. Experimenting with alcohol or marijuana is stated as not being associated with long-term negative consequences for most kids. It's considered pretty normal.
However, cigarette use has more harmful long-term consequences because nicotine is so addictive. It's a worse predictor of later problems than casual alcohol use.
Correlates of abuse include things like prior psychological disturbance and stress, highlighting that problem cluster effect.
A promising intervention plan has to be multifaceted. It needs to combine social competence training with a community-wide focus, start early, and focus on attainable goals, not just total abstinence.
Moving to externalizing problems. Conduct disorder is a repetitive, persistent pattern of antisocial behavior. A less severe diagnosis is oppositional defiant disorder.
We define aggression as acts done to be intentionally harmful, and delinquency is juvenile offending that's processed in the justice system.
And we distinguish between offender types. The life course persistent offender starts early and continues throughout life. The adolescence-limited offender just gets into minor trouble during the teen years, and the behavior stops in adulthood.
Finally, internalizing problems. The presumed underlying cause is high negative affect emotionality. The most common disorder is depression, and its prevalence just explodes in adolescence.
You also see significant sex differences in depression. Girls are twice as likely to suffer from it, and this difference emerges right around puberty.
This is partly explained by coping. Girls are more likely to react to stress by turning inward, by ruminating repetitively, focusing on negative emotions without solving anything.
Contributing factors include genetics, stress, puberty, and unmet desires for intimacy.
Stress, in general, makes teens vulnerable. The goal is to foster resilience, the ability to function despite stress, through social support and internal resources.
And coping strategies fall into two types. Primary control strategies aim to change the stressor itself. Secondary control strategies involve adapting to the problem when you can't change it.
All right, we just covered nearly 160 concepts in one shot. Take a deep breath. Let's do a rapid-fire review, grouping the major conceptual categories for final recall.
Okay, we solidified the biological hardware, the HPG axis as the thermostat, the Tanner stages, the contextual nature of moodiness, and the gender challenges of early maturation. That's the engine.
We covered the cognitive operating system, the shift to formal operations, the errors of egocentrism, imaginary audience, and personal fable, and the brain changes driving sensation-seeking.
We covered the social structures,
Ah.
the dynamics of family conflict, the four parenting styles with authoritative as the ideal, the function of crowds versus cliques, and that critical school mismatch hypothesis.
We covered the psychosocial tasks, Erikson's identity crisis, and the value of the moratorium, the three forms of autonomy, intimacy, and Sullivan's challenge and achievement, including the powerful influence of SES.
And finally, we covered the problem clusters, the difference between externalizing and internalizing, the underlying trait of unconventionality, the two offender types, and the mechanisms of internalizing distress, like female rumination.
So, synthesizing the core insight, we learned that modern society uses a discontinuous passage into adulthood. This prolonged preparation leads directly to emerging adulthood up to age 25.
And this structured delay raises a really important final question for you to think about as you study. If society delays true participation in the workforce until the mid-20s, how does that inherent lack of early independence, that discontinuous passage, ultimately affect our overall capacity for genuine behavioral autonomy when we finally reach full adult status?
Are we sacrificing experience for extended preparation? Think about that interaction. And that's it for this special exam deep dive. Good luck with your preparation.
Study smart, focus on the mechanisms, and we'll catch you next time on the Psychology Undergrad.